My research is about the history of humanitarian aid. So it's contemporary history, it's in the later part of the 20th century mostly. And what I look at is how humanitarianism, which is often considered to be apolitical or neutral, impartial, how humanitarianism is actually very much involved in different kinds of politics. So I'm particularly interested in the politics of solidarity, of radical politics, and the politics of decolonization, and how those have been entangled with humanitarianism in the 20th century. That brings me also into fields of human rights history, and at the moment I'm particularly interested in exploring the field of international humanitarian law from a historical perspective. So that means the laws of war and how different people have tried to put constraints on how we wage war and how that's interacted with the politics of decolonization. I'm interested in supervising anything in the field of humanitarian history, so that might be history of displacement, history of different organizations like the United Nations or non-governmental organizations. I'm interested in the field of human rights history as well, and other areas that are related, like the history of development, for example. Another area of interest of mine is memory studies and how the way that we think about the past has actually influenced humanitarian practice or the way we think about conflict, for example. So thinking about that kind of the participation of the past in the present. A further area of interest of mine is European history of the 20th century, so particularly French history, where I did some of my studies, but broadly speaking, talking about ideas of activism, intellectual engagement, and so on in Europe in the 20th century. So supervision is a really fantastic part of the job. It's something I really, really enjoy because it lets you go through a journey of discovery with your students as well. You learn a lot while you're doing it, you have really fascinating conversations, and you really get to know the person. So it's a part of the job I really value. I really love working with Margot because she works really hard, she has really big ideas, but she's also open to new ideas, to other people's input, and doesn't take herself too seriously. So it's a really free-flowing conversation and a lot of fun when we have our supervision meetings. I think it's also great when you see a student who progresses as you go along the semester. So seeing that sense of progress, of discovery, is really valuable to me as well. My top tip to supervisees is to remember that supervision is not about being led, it's about being supported. So the best way to get the most out of supervision is in fact to think about your own ideas, what matters to you, and to really bring those to all of your discussions. And that starts before you even officially apply, because you can talk to potential supervisors about your research ideas and get input on your proposal itself. My other top tip for supervisees is to take weekends. PhD is very stressful, involves a lot of hard work, but it's really important to maintain a kind of work-life balance and to create space for yourself to relax so your ideas can grow even when you're not thinking about them.
My research is about the history of peacekeeping and decolonization during the Cold War period. So I'm really interested in challenging the idea of peacekeepers as impartial humanitarians during this period and unpacking the ideas surrounding apolitical legitimacy and access on the ground, especially as peacekeeping involves the use of force. So by unpacking the access and legitimacy provided by the UN Security Council, I'm really hoping to look at some case studies and examine the colonial continuities that may have been afforded to these peacekeepers on the ground, and looking at the bureaucracy and how those within the staff of the UN were actually at the forefront of pushing and directing various political crises on the ground, rather than being simply an instrument. So I think the history of peacekeeping is incredibly important, especially during the Cold War period, because it hasn't been massively examined by historians. Typically, the period from the 1990s onwards is focused on, and it's really important to look at the Cold War period in order to better understand the international order and how we start to have this growth in non-governmentality and non-state actor agency, especially in conflicts that we perhaps see as more state-based. So by looking at the agency of the UN on the ground and arguing that it's perhaps more of the political agency of the UN staff rather than state actors that made most of the decisions, is going to be my contribution to the research. I'm really lucky to be supervised by Eleanor, Davey and Salk because we get on really well personally as well as professionally, which has meant that I feel a lot more open and free in having conversations with her, especially during our supervisions. This has meant that my work has actually progressed a lot faster because I believe that I can go to her with things that perhaps would feel a little bit more restricted about, and I can just push the boundaries a little bit more than perhaps I would if I was in a more restricted supervision environment. Equally, because Eleanor is such an amazing supervisor supervisor and academic, she's given me access to a lot of networks in the north and also in the south within the humanitarianism field, which is useful for me both during my PhD but also afterwards. The research facilities that have really benefited me the most during my PhD have been the PhD room in HCRI, which have been fantastic for providing a community feel and also regular tea breaks, which have been really useful for making sure that we get outside of our heads sometimes. Additionally, we have an order a book service with the library, which I've really taken advantage of. So any books that a PhD student may be interested in, you can order into the library, which makes things a whole lot easier if you're a historian. So we have a really strong research community in South, both socially and academically. I've benefited from the social side as in an event that SALC organised before I even began my course. I met two of my close friends at Manchester, and that really helped me to settle in once I actually began my course. Additionally, the academic environment has been fantastic for providing training opportunities, but also debate within the cohort. I took French this year, and although a little intimidating at the beginning, it was a really smooth process for me, as they provided funding, and it also was allowed to be part of my day-to-day life, and in the end it actually was a really crucial part of my chapter. So I've been really impressed with the academic support that SALC provided me. So my top tip for a good supervisor relationship is ensuring that you speak to your supervisor in person or over the phone at least once before you begin your course. When I was applying to all of my different courses before I began, it was the most intimidating thing trying to find a supervisor who I would have a good academic and personal relationship with. And this is crucial for making sure that you have a good understanding and similar wavelength in the way that you approach your project. Additionally, read their work, get a good idea of the people who they're friends with if they're on social media, get an idea of the networks that they're part of and how that will allow you to perhaps get a job afterwards, because you have to start thinking about these things during the PhD. Additionally, it's really important to remember that they're your line manager as well as your academic advisor once you begin your course, and they're there not only to support you but to make sure you actually get through your qualification. So make sure you keep in regular contact with them and keep them up to date with any concerns you have. Don't fall off the world.